All right, you guys want to get started? All right. So first of all, thank you guys so much for coming. I know you have a lot of stuff to choose from today, so I appreciate that you all think that ethics are important enough to show up and be here. I'm Diana. I'm a lead designer at Grand Studio, which is a digital product design consultancy in Chicago. And I lead their voice and future tech efforts there. A lot of what we create are multi-channel experiences. So voice-first apps, screen-based apps that have voice integrations, that kind of thing. And prior to that, I was working in health tech, principally as a content and VUI designer for about 7 years. I also, in the interest of ethics, want to disclose that I've done a very abbreviated version of this talk last year with a colleague of mine, Alana Shalowitz. So I want to give a little shout out to her. A couple of these slides are really influenced by some of her thoughts, particularly the responsibility statement at the end. So I want to make sure we give credit where it's due. So what is the deal with ethics? Obviously, we all have kind of our own interpretations of what ethics are, what morals are. So I just want to lay a little groundwork down. The way that I think about ethics is these are the rules of right and wrong that we either individually or collectively set for behavior or an activity. So I say collectively or individually because this is really something like we don't have a set guidelines as an industry for ethics. So we really have to define this for ourselves first, individually as people, and then also within our teams, our companies, our industry, our country, our world, however we want to take that, we can, but it starts with us, and we really have to find our own line. So I'm gonna walk you guys through a lot of stuff to think about today, and none of this is meant to be hard rules because obviously this comes from my set of right and wrong, and it's really meant to ask that question and give you guys parameters for you to go home and think about where are my lines, what's right or wrong for me, so that you can take that back to your team. So the good news is you're already kind of doing this. Every designer has to make decisions. And I use designer loosely because I know some of us are developers, some of us are product managers, but if you're involved in the design and creation of a product, you're making decisions every day. Whether you decide the tone of the voice that you're gonna use, the word choices that you're gonna use, if you're doing screen design, whether you're gonna have a button or not, all that kind of stuff falls into decision making. And all of those decisions take an ethical stance. I know that we don't really think about that as being ethics-based, but when you are making those decisions, you're thinking about, well, if I do this, it's gonna have this outcome, meaning that I'm going to include somebody, I'm going to exclude somebody, I'm going to be transparent about something, I'm not gonna be transparent about something. Whatever you're doing is constantly reinforcing these stances, even if you're not aware of it. So it's better that we become aware of it so that we know that what we're doing intentionally. Here's a little slide on what happens if you don't consider ethics. And I think we all can pull from recent memory some mishaps that happened along the way with different companies. You know, you could end up being shamed by the entire world. You could end up standing in front of Congress. You could kill someone. So the stakes could get pretty high. Let's hope they don't. But on the flip side, what happens when you do consider ethics, you could wind up like Bumble. They're super ethical. Their whole platform is about creating a safe environment for women in the dating world. They have 50 million users. It's a lot of users. And actually, that's the exact same amount of users as Tinder. So you don't have to fall behind your competition just because you're behaving ethically. They also have a 70% year-over-year growth, which means they're gonna take over Tinder pretty quickly. And they have a $1 billion value, so it's actually kind of lucrative to be ethical. VUI design in particular is at the forefront of tech. So right now, like this is the shiny new thing, voice and VR. And a lot of times we as VUI designers get pulled into these conversations to talk about product road mapping and visioning with either our clients or our stakeholders at our companies. And as VUI designers, we might not know everything there is to know about future tech and where things are headed, but we really need to be thinking about decisions more so than even any other designers or any other stakeholders in the company because we're the people that are getting looked to make those decisions. So we really need to make sure that we have the foresight to think about where things could go and help other people see those same outcomes so we can make a decision collectively about if this is a good idea or not. So there are a couple things that I usually think about when I'm thinking about ethics and what that even means in terms of voice design. And we could break these out differently than what I did, but accessibility is one, and I take a pretty broad stance on accessibility, which we'll get into. Transparency and privacy are both pretty big buckets, but I put them together for the sake of time, and there's a lot of overlap there. And creation, like, what are we making here? So we'll go through each one of these, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about different considerations you should have in each one of these buckets. And we'll start with accessibility. So like I said, I take kind of a broad view of accessibility, and part of that is not just what we would standardly consider accessibility of the physical aspects of it and creating that physical access, but also because conversation is so rooted in social aspects and in culture, we really have to consider inclusivity as part of accessibility. Because when we think about creating access to a conversation, everything that you embed in your conversation, the whole reason that a human would talk to a human is to have connection, to communicate something. So when we think about this with a system, if the system is shutting the person out because of the word choices they're using, or the way in which they're speaking, or the language, all of that is going to deny access. It's going to shut people out and say, this conversation is not for you. So thinking about inclusivity when you think about access is really important. So something that Alana and I would always ask each other when we were working together is, who's here? Who isn't? And are we okay with that? Because the truth is, you don't have to design something that is meant for everybody. And I don't want you guys to walk out of here thinking that if we don't have this thing that's gonna go to every single person, then it's not accessible. That's not true. We saw yesterday the Hira app, which is for pregnant women. It's not for men, it's not for kids, it's not for women who are not pregnant. It is just for women in that context, and that is fine. But then you just have to make sure that all the pregnant women are encompassed in that. So it's really just making sure that your focus is on the people who are going to use your product and that you're creating access for everybody within that particular group. So the two kind of questions that I break out for myself to think about this is more of the standard accessibility question. Can the intended parties use this product regardless of their physical differences? And then does the conversation invite and allow for all intended parties regardless of their background or their cognitive state? And we'll start with that first one. So when we think about physical access, the first thing that comes into my head is accent. This is because I've done a lot of IVR outbound work to the US and having to do, I worked, like I said, in health tech. So a lot of times I was working with hospital systems that had different locations all over the US. Healthcare is obviously pretty high stakes. If you don't get the message to somebody, their health and their life could be affected by that. So we really wanted to make sure that we got this right. And one of the things we noticed was when we would roll something out to people in sort of across the board, and we had the ASR tuned to what we would consider to be like a standard tuning, which is pretty like biased towards Midwest, Northeastern accents, we would lose a lot of people in the Southeast. And what happens is the ASRs are generally not tuned, if you don't actually go in and manually tune them, to accommodate people with stronger accents. So whether that's something like a really strong Brooklyn accent, a really strong Mississippi accent, an English as a second language accent, all of these things are just not what the sound that the ASR is looking to match. So you have to go in and manually tweak it. And full disclosure, I'm not an engineer, so I don't know what like tweaking it means. But I worked with some really smart developers who, once I say that, they're like, okay, I know what to do, and they go in and they do it. So if you have questions on that, I'm happy to refer you to people who actually know more about that specifically. Another thing to consider is speech pace. And this one is kind of ironic to me because voice is actually an accessibility tool for all kinds of screen design. So when people go to a website, it might be read out to them in a voice interface, and they might be able to talk back and forth with it. But the problem that we often don't think about as VUI designers is when we are creating something for sort of the general public, sight-enabled people, we're usually putting it at the pace of a sight-enabled person rather than someone who has any kind of vision impairment. And people with vision impairment actually parse orally much quicker than people who use sight more frequently. So what you end up doing is making it like super slow for somebody who's used to being able to move forward. And that's really hampering to somebody's experience, especially if this is what you're forcing them to use because they can't use the other channel. So we need to consider, like, are there ways that we can allow them to slow up, slow down, the same way that you would, like, on a YouTube video, just 2 times, half time, whatever it is, so somebody can go at their own pace. And we don't have to explicitly lay this out every time. And I think that's something that will come up time and time again. Just because we have these options doesn't mean we have to say every single time. If you want to speed this up, just say 2 times. You know, we can just have it there, and if people want it, they will usually ask for it. If they want something repeated, they'll tell you, can you say that again? Can you repeat that? If they want something faster, they'll be like, ugh, can you just go faster? And if we have that programmed in there, if we've done our job, it will go faster, and that's great, and that's that surprise and delight moment that's also creating this much better path for somebody. Similarly, voice volume control. So on the other side, if you have somebody who is hearing impaired and they're using a VUI, you want to make sure that they can hear it. That doesn't necessarily mean blasting it, though, because if they have their hearing aid in, you could actually be doing more damage. So again, thinking about how can we control volume and allow the user to adjust that as needed. Because this also, by the way, works really well for people who don't have hearing problems because they might be in different contexts when they're using this. So you might have somebody who's in a crowded room and doesn't want the smart speaker shouting everything across. Or you might have somebody who just like needs it a little bit louder that day because noisy things are happening in the next room. So all of these things actually really make it much easier for everybody. This one's probably, like, I think the most obvious for all of us, speech impediments. Those are really difficult to deal with because, again, ASRs aren't really tuned to deal with things like lisps and stutters. So we have to think about, okay, if I know that I'm sending something out to somebody with a stroke who has a really hard time speaking, A, is this the best channel that I could do for that specific population? B, is there another channel that I could use in addition to this to allow somebody to go back and forth so that whether it's temporary, whether it's permanent, they have an option to move back and forth as needed and be able to communicate and move through the process. Which brings us to multimodal interactions. So whenever you're thinking about voice stuff, always ask yourself, like, is this a way that I could be doing this only with voice? Is this the most appropriate way to do it? Is it more appropriate to combine things? Should voice be involved at all? I love voice. That's my job. But also, it's not always the best solution to everything, and I think all of us get really wrapped up in the excitement of like accomplishing this in voice and putting that user first of like, who is my user? What are their needs? Could there be another channel to this? Is really useful. So to recap, when you're enabling physical access, play with the ASR, allow the user to control volume, keep the prompts short. This is another thing for pacing. If you're having people listen to really long-winded prompts, it just slows down the process in general, and especially if you have somebody who's used to having things move at a quicker clip, you just keep your prompts short. You don't even have to play with the pace of it. It just moves along faster. So you sort of give the impression of speed without actually having to change the speed. And then allow for the same channel or multimodal experience. So now let's think about the cognitive state. And I know most people, when they think about cognitive state, they start to think about things like memory or dementia or children and different levels of cognition. And those are certainly, I think, the first ones that I go to. But we can also think about cognition in terms of a temporary state or a permanent state. And before I go into that, I do want to caution all of us, because I had somebody bring this up recently, and I thought it was pretty interesting. When we are talking about accessibility, and we do have a broader definition of it. I think it's really important that we're all careful about how we position that to stakeholders who are not thinking about the user experience, because a lot of times what they'll hear is, oh, that's a nice to have. That's not essential. We don't have to have that in MVP because it's not like they need to have that. That's just a temporary thing. So especially when we're like kind of extending the definitions, I know I need to be careful about this, so I'm sharing with you too, that we are making sure that there are lines in the sand wherever you and your product feel like they need to be for your stakeholders to say, this is necessary, this is the nice to have, so you're really clear with them. So, cognitive accessibility, can people use this no matter what their cognitive state is? And when I say temporary, I think the easiest example that I can give is if you have a pizza ordering app, which everybody loves to use the pizza ordering app example. Yes, you want to think about this like, okay, could somebody with dementia order a pizza? But like, really, how many people with dementia are ordering a pizza, and like, should they be? Should children be? Probably more appropriate for that product is thinking about, are my users drunk or stoned? That's not a permanent situation, but it is going to affect cognitive state, and so you probably want to consider it. Again, that's where I think that line of like nice to have versus mandatory comes into play, but a really fun website, if you have not checked this out, they have this for screen design. This is a guy who was a UX designer, and he does usability testing drunk, so he can tell you if your website is actually working or not. And we can think about this for voice, too, about doing, like, I don't know, maybe you have like a couple of your coworkers, and you guys do some Wizard of Oz testing drunk and see how that goes. Could be a fun exercise. So things to think about with cognitive access are literacy level. I think we all kind of know this, but generally, the longer and bigger vocabulary words that you use, the more energy it takes for somebody to parse that and understand it. And that's true even if they're like super educated. We found this with doctors when you're giving a doctor who's presumably one of the more educated people. They go through a lot of years of education. They have to deal with really complicated stuff. You give them something that's not in their field. So if you go to a cardiologist and you say, hey, here's some information about the liver, and you talk to them in medicalese, they have no idea what you're saying. These people are trained in it. So it's really important that we just strip all of the assumptions that we have about people's education out of it and think about this in terms of they don't have anything else in front of them. All they have is the voice, and it's gone in a second. So we have to make this as easy to understand as possible so that they can follow along without being condescending, of course, because we don't want to dumb it down and make people feel like you're talking down to them. So with memory, something that I've found working on dementia products is if you phrase things in chronological order and you give people one task at a time, they can follow it. This is actually also very true for people whenever you're giving them directions, like if you have a VUI in the car, if you have something in the kitchen where you're giving them instructions on how to cook something, it becomes much easier if you give people one task at a time instead of joining tasks together and doing dual tasks, and then phrasing them in the order that they are meant to happen. So for example, if I were to tell you to go turn on the coffee pot in the kitchen, that becomes a little complicated because I've told you to go turn on the coffee pot. So it's a task, that's an action that you're going to do. You take the step to go do it, and then it's in the kitchen. So you have to pause and wait and think, okay, in the kitchen, and then I'm gonna reorder that so that I'm gonna, in the kitchen, go to the coffee pot, got it. You have to do a lot of work, even though we don't really think about that amount of work that we're doing, we have to do a lot of work to put that together. Whereas if I just say, go to the kitchen and turn on the coffee pot, it's in the order that that action needs to take place, and you can just follow along with it. Pronouns are kind of tricky. I know that we all want to make everything friendly and easy, and this does help with shortening things too, which is obviously we talked about, good to do. But if it's not impeccably clear what that pronoun is referring to, don't use it, because then that just requires so much more on the person to think, wait, did the it refer to the coffee pot, to the kitchen? Where is that it going? And now you've sort of lost them because they're focusing on what that pronoun is referring to. So really play with your testing on this to make sure that all of your pronouns are very clear and have a reference point. And then, of course, acronyms and jargon. Like, how many times have we all started a new job and just been like, what is anybody talking about? It's the worst. So we don't have any kind of helpful friend or book of terms that somebody can throw at you. So we have to make sure that we're not using that. And if we are going to use things like that, that we're really clear about what those mean, and that we're defining that or giving people the opportunity to say, wait, what does that mean? So we can define it for them. Recap. Avoid jargon. Phrase in sequential order. Allow repetition. This is that thing that we talked about previously of we don't have to say this explicitly, but if you allow people the option to say, can you repeat that again? I want to hear that one more time. What did you say? That allows them to get that piece of information again so they don't have to remember it. And that also does a little work for you too. So like if you forgot and you gave them too much information or gave them a couple of tasks to do at once, you now have a handy help to like get everybody back on track. And be clear about your pronouns. So the last piece, let's talk about background, which is really the inclusivity part of this. So when we're thinking about inclusive access, we're really thinking about the cultural components and the social components of speech and conversation. Word and slang choices are a big part of that. So I think Andy talked a little bit about personas, and we've all sort of thought about, okay, who is this character that is speaking to my users? What do I want them to say? Why do I want them to say it? But it's important to understand that no matter what you do in terms of a persona, if you commit to a strong character, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but if you do it, you're going to be inclusive for some people and exclusive for other people. Because those word choices that you make are going to be referential and inclusive and pulling people in for the people who know what you're talking about. And for the people who don't, it's going to feel like, oh, okay, I guess I don't know that part of the conversation. All right. And the more that you do that, the more it feels like this conversation is not for you. So you can get away with it once or twice. You can get away with it all the time if you're doing the pregnant app and all you have are like, I don't know, pregnant lingo, whatever pregnant lingo would be. You could do that, but you have to know why you're making those choices and make sure that it's something that everybody in that group would know. Names are another big one, because I know a lot of us do introductions to bots where you say something like, hi, I'm PizzaBot, what's your name? If you don't actually have the ability to parse everybody's name on the other side of that, that's immediately slamming the door in somebody's face on that conversation. And I've worked on a lot of different platforms, and I will tell you that none of them is very inclusive, because machine learning. Like, we've all trained these machines to recognize Anglo-American names. Like, those are really the ones that get recognized right away. But anytime you put in something that's not that, you start to run into trouble. And I know that I've had to do like a lot of heavy lifting of training, and I'm not going to get every single name. So then you start to have to ask yourself, like, okay, do I need to build this from scratch? Is there more training that I can do? Who could I get to help me with this? Do I even need to have a name? All these sorts of questions, but just know that if you're going to set yourself up for having names in there, you better be able to recognize that, because nothing is more exclusive than saying, I'm sorry, I didn't understand your name. That's just terrible, terrible. Humor is another one that I love humor, and I always want to include it, and I try so hard. There's like nothing that's really safe other than dad jokes, unfortunately. Humor is so reliant on the context, on the relationship, and on references. And if you don't have just complete security and knowledge of who your users are and what their contexts are, if you haven't built that relationship with them, it's very hard to use humor effectively. So I'm not saying don't use it, I'm just saying be cautious and be thorough on it. And then cultural references, which is similar to words or slang choices. When you choose a reference point that you're going to be like, well, everybody, I had Seinfeld up there. Everybody knows Seinfeld. Untrue. I definitely showed my age around my colleagues at work when I showed them. They're like, who's that? So like just be aware that like anytime that you think you might have like, well, this was like such a cultural touch point, how could people not know this? It was a cultural touch point for you, for your group of people and the people that are around you. But as we've seen time and time again, as the years have gone by, that we all kind of live in bubbles. And even though it might feel like that resonates with you and the people around you, it might not resonate for your user base. So it's really important to be sure you're doing research around that to make sure that if you're gonna use those, that those are things that actually resonate with the people who are gonna be using your product. So again, include or avoid slang appropriately. Get outside your perspective. Go and do some research. Be around people. Humor is not all-encompassing, unfortunately. And use cultural touch points that function for everybody. Here's a nice little checklist. I asked myself these questions. Is this VUI accessible? So it's probably okay if your product is built for a specific user group for their particular experience. Again, thinking about the pregnancy app. It's probably okay if your product categorizes users by access needs in order to give them a more personalized experience. Meaning, if it knows, if like it's asked the user, hey, do you have any visual needs that we should know about? And then once it knows that about the user, can put them into the faster speed version of it. Great, you've just made them like not have to choose that or not have to ask for that just by knowing something about them. It probably needs questioning if you've never even discussed accessibility. And it probably needs questioning if your reasons for excluding populations are based on business or resource rationale and not on user rationale. And I know that we've all run into this at some point or another where somebody says, we don't have time for that, or we don't have money for that. That's just, we'll get to it in the next release. And I would really encourage everybody to push back on that if you know that part of your user group is going to need something in terms of access, to say, no, this really has to be part of that first release if we want to have something successful here. Because you get one shot. Once people try it and it's not inclusive for them or they can't get access to it for whatever reason, they're not going to come back and try again. People's patience is very thin and their threshold for this is very low. So we need to make sure that we're really hitting that mark every single time as much as we can. Okay, let's talk about transparency and privacy. I found this study so fascinating. So this is from 2017. And in this study, 20% of users were not aware that their smart device was listening to them. And to us in this room, that probably seems crazy because, like, of course it's listening. Like, how else do you think it's going to hear you when you say, hey, Alexa? But it's not obvious. Like, in the same way that I know I was shocked when I found out my phone was listening to me. Like, that didn't seem obvious to me. But of course it is. Again, like, these are things that, as the creators of stuff, we sort of take for granted that people know. But nobody's telling the general public this, so of course they don't know that. They don't realize that. And we really need to take this to heart because I think this is at the crux of transparency. We assume a lot about what people know and don't know based on what we know and don't know. And we're not that great about telling people stuff because it might be a kind of awkward conversation. So when you're thinking about what you're going to share, you might want to consider sharing who the system is. Like, who is this company? What do you guys do? What the system's motives are? Why is it asking for certain information? And where is it getting data from? Where is it pulling stuff? So when it provides the user with information or with context or with a reference point, if that's a surprise to the user, that's not going to be a pleasant experience. But if you're telling it like, oh, hey, I checked your Facebook page and I see that you like dogs. Should we talk about puppies? Like, that's at least, it's still a little creepy, but at least it's like telling you why it's being creepy, and then you can go and be like, hey, don't look at my Facebook page. So when you're enabling transparency, there's sort of this, the Alexa skills versus the Google duplex kind of way of thinking of it, which is also the system-initiated, user-initiated versus system-initiated, but you can do this with system-initiated too. Alexa is always very obviously contained. So when you say like, hey Alexa, open up this skill, let's do this, you know, the user's initiating it, they know they're talking to a machine, there's no mystery there. With something like Google Duplex, it was basically trying to trick people into not knowing that it was a machine. And people got super creeped out by that because we weren't being clear that this is a machine talking to them. And I've also done a ton of these outbound robocalls, and something that I found just crazy was that we had to, because again of HIPAA and health rules, we had to get certain pieces of information before we could disclose health stuff. And when you're calling somebody, you don't necessarily know who you're gonna get. So there was one phone call that we did for a very stringent healthcare system who needed not only the date of birth, but also the social security number of the person before they could disclose any health information. And upon hearing this, the whole design team was like, what? No one's ever gonna give that over the phone. But we were able to build enough trust by saying things like, hey, I'm calling from this particular doctor, from this particular health system, for this person. Are you this person? And if they said yes, then we would say, okay, I really want to give you some health information, but I can't because of HIPAA laws, and we want to make sure that we're not disclosing your information with somebody who's not you. So the only way that I can check that is by checking the information that I have in my system. The information that I have in my system is your birth date and your social security number. Can you verify those for me? An extraordinary amount of people verified that. We would have over 30% acceptance rates, which to me is insane. That sounds like a phishing scam. It does not sound like something you would ever do. But because we were able to tell them who we were, why we needed the information, that it was for their protection and their privacy, people were willing to disclose it. Another thing to sort of answer for yourself is having the system answer, why do I want your information and what am I gonna do with it? So the same sort of thing with that call. We were telling them, well, here's why I need this information. I need to check it against our records to make sure that you are who you say you are. And if I don't know that, then I won't give out your information. So that's really helpful for people to know that you're not just taking it and then going and doing whatever with it. I just need your social security number, don't worry about it. And then how do I know what I know about you? That goes back to that data source. How do I know that you like dogs? Well, if I tell you that I got it from your Facebook page, that this is out in the public, fine. Then at least I know, maybe I need to go make that private. Or great, I don't care, that's out in the world. I'm really happy about that. But if you're just telling me that you know that I like dogs, that's where I start to get creeped out, that maybe you're able to access things that I don't want you to access or that I didn't allow you. That's when your phone's listening to you and you start to get creeped out. I don't know if you guys remember, but there was a couple in, I think, Oregon, who were having a pretty innocuous conversation about flooring. And the Alexa heard it and for whatever reason thought they wanted it recorded, transcribed into an email, and sent to a colleague. And the colleague called and was like, hey, pretty sure you didn't mean this for me, but just so you know, this happened. And they were like, what? And there was a whole big kerfuffle over it, and the woman said, I felt invaded, a total privacy invasion. Immediately I said, I'm never plugging that device in again because I can't trust it. And those are the stakes that we're up against. Every single time that we do something to erode someone's trust, that's somebody who's not gonna come back to the platform. That's somebody who's not gonna use voice-enabled devices, and if this is something that we really see a future for and that we see all these problems it can solve, we need people to trust it. And it's our job to help build that trust with them. And the more that we erode it, the less people are gonna be participating in that. So when you're thinking about listening into calls or listening into interactions, you wanna think about who's benefiting here? Why do I really need to listen into these? I think anybody who's had the opportunity to listen into an interaction knows how valuable that can be from the design perspective. But think about who else could hear these? Where could that information go? When is the device listening? Are we being clear about when the device is listening? Are we being clear that we are listening? Just recently, that whole blow up that there were employees of Alexa listening to interactions. People freaked out. And of course, again, we all sort of think yeah, duh, how do you think it's gonna get any better? But we're not telling people. And that's so important to tell people so that they know where their information's going and why. You also want to think about if you're going to store anything, who can access that? What sort of security is based around that? How do they access it? Are there ways that it could be disclosed accidentally? You're not going to solve every problem, but it's really important to think about it so that you at least have some way of pointing out where the problems could be so your team can deal with this. You don't have to solve all the problems, but it is helpful to bring them up at least. Roomba is a company that does this really well, or iRobot. They have floor plans for everybody's house because the Roomba goes around and knows exactly where all the walls are. They guard that information like Fort Knox. Like, not even their employees can get into it. It is purely just for the homeowner. And they take trust super, super seriously, and people use Roombas all the time. Nobody's concerned that somebody's gonna break into their house. Nobody's concerned that, like, the company's gonna start selling them drywalling or, I don't know, whatever. They know that, like, that's for them, and that's the only thing that's gonna know about their house layout. I also want to bring this up. I know this is kind of a testy one, but it's going to happen more. Listening for the law. We have these devices that can hear things, and we've already seen that sometimes the government and judges are trying to pull these in to use them as evidence. In New Hampshire, the judge ordered the Alexa transcripts. They have closed cases, so we can't actually see if they were successful in that or not, and Amazon has not commented on that. In the Bentonville case, the suspect eventually was like, there's nothing here, oh my God, just give it to them. So they got it without having to actually go through that battle. But we're gonna see more and more of this, and I think it's important to think about, like, how are we protecting people's privacy if the government could pull these transcripts? Are we allowing people to know when they're being recorded, when they're being listened to? The Echo has that, like, awesome little blue circle around it, which is such a clever way to show that it's listening without having to interrupt a conversation. But what happens if you don't have sight? What happens if your back is turned to it? How do you know that it's listening? So we have to think through, like, what are the other ways? Could there be, like, a ding or something with it? Could there be any other way that we could be letting people know in a more explicit manner so that if we do wind up in a situation where now the government can pull it whenever they want to, that people aren't feeling betrayed or like they just need to rip everything out and go live a hermit life in the woods. So let's do a checklist. It's probably okay if you have an explicit opt-in from your user. It's probably okay if the system's telling the user where the information is coming from or going. It's probably okay if the data used is to improve the experience or recommendations only for the user. But it probably needs questioning if it's an implicit opt-in, if it involves pulling something that the user is not aware that it has access to. If there's a non-transparent customization that's purely for convenience's sake. If a data share is happening with a third party, and I will include employees as a third party because people think of them as a third party. And any time in the process that you hear the phrase, oh, they know that, that's obvious, stop, that's a huge red flag. We need to check ourselves. I'm gonna go quickly through creation because I know we only have a little bit of time left. Because again, we're in sort of this forefront of creating these products, it's really important for us to ask the question, just because we can build something, should we? Do we really need to make this thing? What is it gonna look like if we do? When you have a speech UI, it's embedded with all of this humanity. Speech and conversation are innately human. So we have to be cognizant of that. There's a lot that goes into that, which is awesome. Like, it makes for all these great solutions to things like loneliness, addiction, all these really tough to handle topics. But we also have to think about the reverse of that then. Okay, well, what do we have to supply as designers, as creators of these products, to uphold that relationship and that level of humanity? If we're not ready to do that yet, then we might not want to make that product. So a good sort of set of questions you can ask yourself is, am I making the user's life better or just making the business more efficient? That's not to say that you can't do both, but it's always a good line to ask yourself. Am I displacing someone's livelihood? Is that for the better? And for whom? Is the outcome something that matches my values or is it against them? That's, I think, probably the most important one because, yeah, obviously, like the ones above it have an opinion. The one about matching your values, you have to really figure out, like, what's my right, what's my wrong, and am I willing to stand for this? If this were to go, like, if I were the creator of, God, any number of the Facebook mishaps that have happened, would I be willing to stand by that and say, like, well, no, here's why I did this. The intent was here, I saw the outcomes, I knew this could go wrong, but here's where I tried to stop it, here's the parameters I put in place for that. Think about sort of the worst case scenario. Are you willing to defend it? If you're not, then you probably need to have a bigger conversation around that. So what now? That's a lot. Guess what? You guys are all responsible now. So it's up to you guys to really take this information, process it, and implement it with your teams. Whatever pieces of this felt like, great, that's something that we can use. Take it back and share it with people. This is up to all of us in this room who care about this enough to be here, to share this with other people who just might not even be aware of it. I love this responsibility statement. This is one that Alana and I put together. But I think this is really helpful to share with other people and to start that conversation about what you guys want your ethics to look like. So including open discussions, including the possible outcomes of what this work is going to be. Listing not just the benefits of the design when you're presenting it to somebody, but also the trade-offs that you're going to have for taking those benefits. And then defending your decisions, of course, but also not being afraid to question them. And you can be successful and do this. There are people out in the world that are doing this now, and they're actually, I know Apple's had some privacy issues, so they're lower on the list. But OpenAI, Mozilla, they are all very ethically based companies, and they are doing very successfully. From the voice side, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Pretzel Labs, but that's Deibel, her company, and they're working with Mindset right now. They're doing an Alexa skill for kids that helps them teach English as a second language to Israeli kids. And they're doing some really cool inclusivity stuff of it's kids. They want to talk about the stuff that's important in their life. Stuff that's important in their life is like pop stars. And yes, they're going to reference Ariana Grande, but they're also going to reference Israeli pop stars. So she's been including stuff like that in those skills, which really makes it feel like it is part of their conversation and their world, and she understands them. And I know that not all of us are in a position of power, so I want to have this on here because it is really difficult anytime that you're in any sort of marginalized role to have a conversation with somebody who's in a position of power. And as part of that, it's really, I think, important to build your case and defend it for people, because a lot of times people aren't willing to see a problem, but they are willing to have a conversation about a solution. So if you can look at what the business is doing, nobody wants to come into something and say like, we're gonna make something evil. Nobody's doing that. They are trying to solve a real problem. So take a step back, look at what the business is actually trying to accomplish, and consider the potential outcomes, both positive and negative, of the solution that they've presented, something that you're having a problem with. And think about like, okay, if this is the problem they're trying to solve, these are the benefits that they're excited about, what is another way that we can deal with these things without going this particular route that's going to be problematic? And bring your concerns to somebody who can make a change. Hopefully that's somebody who's an ally for you, and allow them to correct you if you're wrong, because you might not have all the information. A lot of times we're given just a slice of stuff, and somebody above us has more of the picture. So you can tell them like, hey, this is my understanding of what the business is trying to do. This is my understanding of like why you're doing this. Here are the things that I think might go wrong, so here's another way we could solve this. Am I understanding all of that correctly? That allows somebody to feel like you're really thinking through things and helping save their butt too, without attacking them. And the good news is, people are listening to people. They're listening to employees, they're listening to loud voices and squeaky wheels. You don't have to do this alone. You can find a buddy, especially if you don't have anybody that you can talk to who's in a position of power. Just find a buddy, and then two of you can go talk. And you don't have to be on your own, and there's no power in numbers. And the whole, like, thinking about why we're even doing this in the first place. This is a quote from Dr. Thomas King, who is at the Oxford University, and he was talking about just like AI and this whole robot revolution in general. And I thought this was applicable to what we're doing. When you're interacting, who or what you're interacting with shapes how we interact. That shapes our humanity, especially in these very human instances of things like conversation. If you start blurring the lines, then this can sow mistrust into all kinds of interactions, where we become more suspicious, as well as needlessly replacing people with meaningless agents. And this just goes back to the general question of, what world do we want to create? Why are we doing what we're doing? And is this really the right thing to put out into the world? Thank you, guys. So that's actually, like, we're exactly at time. I will go around the corner so that whoever is coming in here next can set up, but I'd love to talk to anybody who's interested.
There's going to be a break now, so
Oh, awesome.
yeah, until 4:15, so.
Sweet. Let's chat. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? Yeah.
We were talking a lot about, considering accessibility in a lot of different forms. Can you give an example of something you worked on where you did implement a lot of those things? Like, say, asking whether or not the user was blind or had reading issues, and then had a whole nother path for that?
So I did one. I haven't done one with the blind one, but I've done it with stroke and with schizophrenia, so cognitive and physical. With the stroke, we made sure we had the benefit of a phone. So we brought up the keypad and said, feel free to use the keypad if speech is not comfortable for you right now. And we gave them like a yes/no binary 1-2 kind of thing, and and made sure we were only asking yes or no questions throughout the whole thing, so they had a quick way to do it and they didn't have to keep like hunting for things or trying to relearn or burden down anybody else with repeating instructions that nobody needs. So that was solving that one. With the schizophrenia one, part of that is this discomfort with robots and automation in general. So the first question was, why are we doing this over the phone? Maybe we don't do this automated. But we talked to some social workers and to some users, some patients, and everybody was like, no, this would be okay, especially because most of this population is medicated. We have a pretty good sense that they're at least like somewhat medicated, so it's not going to be like incredibly scary or invasive for them. Just make sure that you're telling them that it is a robot so that nobody's, like, that's not adding to the paranoia of it. So with that one, we were even more explicit. So we were like, immediately when they picked up the phone, like, hi, this is a recording from your doctor. And then like throughout the whole thing was like, your doctor asked me to send this recording. Just reinforce that like, this is not you. This is legitimately a recording. And here's what you're going to expect, so that people didn't feel like we were trying to trick them or play into anything. Anybody else? Yeah.
So I'm more interested in what Brand Studio itself does, because I'm not familiar with what you guys do. So is it just for IVRs cases, or is it also like anything else outside of like phone calls?
Yeah, so when I worked in health tech, I worked a lot on IVR. At Grand, I almost worked exclusively on voice-first apps. So
anything that's voice interaction.
Yeah, so that one is much more like a digital app that has either a skill attached to it or has a voice enablement piece of it. Yeah, in the back.
Do you ever encounter complications where you're trying to solve for accessibility issues or inclusion or anything like that, and they kind of mesh together, so it's like either or?
Yeah.
And what do you do in this situation?
Honestly, I rely heavily on research. So if there is a group that we can see, like, okay, there are more people with speech impediments than there are, like, I don't even know what the inclusivity version of that would be, then we would go the route that has more users. it's tough. Like anytime that we can, usually what I wind up doing for inclusivity stuff is if I don't know my population really well, I will just pull back from it, which pulls back from sort of the personality side of things and makes it a little bit blander, but I know at least it's gonna be clearer and easier for people to use. And it sort of goes back to like the screen design equivalent of it is you have to make it useful before you can make it pretty. And for voice, it's similar, like you have to make it useful before you can make it fun.
Yeah. Like you have to have the foundation before you start pretty.
Yeah, so if there's any like kind of threat of that falling off, usually it's to strip that out and focus on the whole point of it. Yeah?
Can I just pick up on the other question about what you do? You're talking about digital apps. Can you give me a thumbnail sketch of one of the things you've done?
Yeah, so I can tell you one right now that we're working on. It's for an HR, like for small HR teams when there's like only 1 or 2 people, and they're trying to do all of the HR tasks. We've created this action on Google that allows you, called Hire Helper, that only does hiring-related HR tasks, and it integrates with Google Hire, Google Calendar, and Gmail, so that it can pull real-time information about candidates, like where they came from, what they're coming, like the role they're coming in to interview for, gives you a snapshot of your calendar for the day if you're the HR person. Here are your hiring tasks that you have to get done. If there's somebody else that needs to just come in and be like, I'm supposed to go meet this person, I need their resume right away, and the HR person's not at their desk, it can Slack them the resume so they have that there and go in. That kind of just,
Thank you.
yeah.
Have you worked in a scenario case where there are more than one person like talking to this, I guess like voice interaction? So it's like a group setting by chance?
Like a game or something like that where you have like several people talking at once?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I'll think about that. Maybe one will come to mind, but nothing's immediately jumping to mind where I've done that. Does anybody else? Yes.
You know, it's against the law to impersonate a police officer. And I've actually heard the suggestion that perhaps it should be against the law to impersonate a police. In other words, making the mistake of acting like you're a person when you're actually a machine. Do you think that that would be a reasonable, societal, socially responsible response to this problem? Or is that like too much and just let it happen?
I don't see a good reason for somebody to pretend that they are human if they are not, like for a system to do that if they're not human, because even in situations where you would want disclosure on stuff, like of sensitive information, people are going to disclose more when they know it's a robot than when they know it's a human, so you're going to get more out of them anyway if you tell them it's a robot. I would hesitate on the law only because American law isn't traditionally the most fair. So I would be curious to see how that would play out, but in general, I think that would be an interesting way to go, because there's not really, in my opinion, a good reason to pretend that you're a person if you're not a person.
Do you think the market might play that out? So we've heard over and over, be transparent, tell people you're a robot. So if we have some fictitious vendor that tries to make users believe that their robot is human, would the market just play that out and it wouldn't get adoption, it wouldn't get use, it would get trusted, and therefore it get abandoned?
There was a lot of backlash on what Google did with like their demos of the outbound calls to the restaurants to collect your hours.
I think it's also like, I mean, I don't know of any other products other than Duplex that was so widely publicized of not being human, but it's not always, I think, so obvious. Like there are robocalls specifically for phishing reasons that are going to pretend that they're human without being human. So I don't know that the market can necessarily like disengage with that and say, oh, well, we're not going to buy that because you're never going to buy that anyway. That's not the point of that one. So I'm curious to see like if that goes unchecked. I don't know.
Well, maybe market
They have this consortium here. They started with privacy, and now there is an effort to do regulations for ethical regulations for AI. So they're actually a committee that is currently working, was chosen carefully, currently working on the regulation. So this will come out like the GDPR, and maybe the US will adopt it as well.
Yeah.
But that's actually happening. There is a talk and there is a walk. So we're doing it.
I think it matters culturally too.
Yeah.
I think in China and Japan, there are some groups of people that prefer something that sounds more humanistic because they already adopted the fact that they're talking to something and like that may not be human, but they want it to sound as human as possible. And there's some like cultural differences in that. And I know like as an American culture, like when we look at that, it's kind of weird. It feels a little odd that you may or may not be talking to something that is or isn't a robot. But sometimes in like the Asian markets, they really like the idea that it's a robot that can be as human as possible. I'm not saying that's everyone in Asia.
Yeah, no, I'm curious because I know, like, I've seen examples of what you're talking about, but it's almost always user initiated. So, like, don't they kind of have context that it's going to be a robot anyway?
Yeah, but in terms of like the way it sounds,
Yeah.
they really like it when it sounds like superhuman. They're like, that's cool. Like, I don't know, it's just interesting that they see the more positive sides of that.
Yeah.
It's just interesting, like, me being here, it feels like I keep looking at the negative sides of that. So it's just interesting cultural, like, expectations of it. So,
Yeah, I think because we're such an individualistic society, we naturally just kind of distrust that everybody else is out to get us. And that's probably where that comes from.
it's interesting.
Anyone else? All right, thank you guys so much for coming.